in the United States, the laws in each state are actually really different. And here in Brazil, like they say that it's a federal republic. It's called the Federal Republic of Brazil, but it's not very federal. It's all centralized.
Not very Republican.
Yeah. It's like those Democratic Republic of whatever in the Soviet Union. It's none of those things. But can you think of a good example of like a state law that is really different between the two states closest to you, maybe Oregon and Washington?
Oh boy. So in my work, one of the big things is in Washington and Idaho and California, they have community property laws where when you get married and you start accumulating property during your marriage, there's a legal fiction kind of the marital community. And so unless you keep it separate, all of the property that you gain during your marriage is community property. And so it belongs half to one spouse or half to the other, regardless, unless you keep it separate. And Oregon it's actually much older than those other states. And so Oregon is a separate property state where when you get married, unless you buy property, you can buy property jointly together, or you can have it separate. And so it makes a big difference when you die, whether the property is jointly owned or separately owned. And it also can make a difference like when you get divorced and that kind of thing. Although, it kind of works out the same in the end, because when you get divorced in Oregon, the judges try to make equal as best they can. So community property is one that is different.
Yeah. I also know, like, I was reading a few months ago about this Oregonian case that went all the way to the Supreme Court about jury trials. And that in Oregon, for a jury trial for a criminal case, you didn't actually need a unanimous jury.
Right.
You could have, was it one or two of the jurors?
10-2 or 9-3, something like that. Yeah.
Could disagree with the verdict, and the defendant would still be found guilty. And Oregon was the only state, or was there another state?
Probably
Oregon
one of the few.
Yeah, Oregon was the only state in the country that had this law. And so I don't remember how that turned out. Do you? I remember it went to the Supreme Court, but I don't remember what they said.
I believe they decided you have to have unanimous juries, which you can imagine there's years of people being convicted with less than unanimous juries. So they have to be let loose and either retried to see if they can get a unanimous jury or just not charged again.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how would OJ case look like in a not unanimous jury.
Well, I don't know what he was acquitted, but I don't know what how many people voted.
Yeah,
quit.
I don't remember.
Yeah, was it the other way too? Could you have a 9-3 acquittal? Because you have to have unanimous acquittals too. No, otherwise, it's just a hung jury.
No, I don't know. If you need a unanimous jury and it's 10-2, the person's acquitted.
It's not a hung jury. It's
not a hung jury as far as I know. Yeah.
Okay.
So, but
okay.
It could be.
And then what is the process for this? Because this was a state law, right? And so then why did the U.S. How did it get to the U.S. Supreme Court? Like,
do you have time for all this? It's
a little bit of time.
It can be it can be kind of complicated.
Give us the express version.
All right. Well, so in the United States, we have our U.S. Constitution, and then all the different states have their state constitution, and then the state legislatures will also enact laws. And the U.S. Constitution says that it is the supreme law of the land.
And the federal Congress will also enact laws.
Right.
So you have these laws running around.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the federal laws, the U.S. Congress has to have there has to be a provision in the Constitution that says they can enact the laws that they're enacting.
So like the U.S. Congress can't make a law that says no chewing gum. There's not really a provision in the Constitution for that, right?
Right. And so
but a state legislature could?
State legislature could. Sometimes the U.S. Congress will sort of finesse the issue, for instance, the highway speed limit. Is you wouldn't think that the federal government would have the ability to say what the speed limit should be in the state of Oregon, and it really doesn't. But what the Congress says is, look, if you want highway funding from us, you will make your speed limit 55. And then most of the states will comply because they want the money. So you have federal constitution, state constitution, and then the state legislature will enact laws like if you have a criminal case, you have to have a 9-3 verdict. And then originally, the US Constitution only applied to the Congress in Washington. And it was that way for many years until after the Civil War, we adopted the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And I don't remember what it said, but it said something like, no state will deprive people of the protection of the laws or due process. You have to look it up. But since then, almost all of the Bill of Rights, we have the first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. Almost all of them, the US Supreme Court had said, all right, states, the First Amendment applies to you, the Second Amendment applies to you. Actually, the Second Amendment was pretty recent, probably in the last 20 years, where they said the Second Amendment applies to the states.
And that one is about guns, right? It says
That's about guns, the right to bear arms. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, I didn't read this case, so I don't know what it said, but Oregon had a law that said you can convict somebody with less than a unanimous verdict. And so it went to the Supreme Court and they said, no, under the 14th Amendment, probably the federal law, the federal Constitution requires that states have a unanimous verdict. And therefore that state law is null and void.
Okay, nice. So that brings us to another case, and that's a recent one in Oregon, and it has to do with the recent coronavirus, the COVID-19 situation. But before we get to the case, I just want to ask you, how is the situation there with the coronavirus? Is it very bad? What is your general perception of the situation in Oregon, or can be?
Yeah, in Oregon, it's not bad at all. And I could look up the numbers. The numbers are not big. And most of the cases are like in Canby, just off the road here, that way. The next block over, there's it's a nursing home and assisted living place. And if you look at New York or Washington or other places, the vast majority of the COVID-19 cases are in nursing homes. And over here, it's not very big nursing home. I don't know how many people they have, but they have more cases yesterday. I think they had 19 cases.
Just there, just in that
Just
nursing home.
here. Yeah, and I think Oregon has, I don't remember, a couple thousand cases. But you know, in nursing homes, the residents are more susceptible to the virus.
And it's hard to maintain social distance because to care for the residents, you have to touch them. It's not possible to. Okay.
So workers are coming in. I think they cut off visitors a while back, but the workers go home and they might pick up the virus somewhere, and then they come to work and they pass it on to the patient. But the vast majority in Oregon and Washington, as far as I know, are elderly people, mostly in nursing homes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anybody personally that has it.
Yeah, I don't. I know people who know people. That's the most that I know. How has the whole situation, the outbreak, the lockdown orders, the everything affected you? Has it changed your routine or changed your life? How?
Not particularly. I still get up and go to my office, which is only 3 blocks away, and I'm there by myself. I don't have a staff except your mom comes in when she wants to. So I have had people, mostly elderly people, have postponed coming in, but I had work that was in process, and so fewer people have come in, but I've been going and doing my work every day. So I used to go, well, we go to church every week. Church is shut down, and so it's online. I would normally meet my dad for coffee at Denny's a couple times a week, but Denny's was shut down until yesterday. So we didn't do that. We've been going up to his house to visit him. I haven't been able to get a haircut for a couple months. That's on schedule now. Let me think. A week or so ago, the governor said, all right, counties, you can apply to reopen in stages. And so almost all the counties applied, and most of them got approved right away, because if you're in Eastern Oregon, there's hardly any people there, and so it's not really a problem. But Marion and Polk County, Ryan will know, where Salem is the capital of Oregon, they applied and got turned down, and then they reapplied and got approved. Clackamas County applied a little later, and it got approved this last week to open up yesterday. And so Denny's is back open now, and we can get a haircut. Our church hasn't opened yet. They'll probably wait till phase 2. In phase 1, you're only supposed to have like 25 people in a gathering. Phase 2, you can have 100 people in a gathering, and you have to open up under phase 1 and then not have any spike in cases for 21 days, and then you can move on to phase 2. So we're in process. Multnomah County and Washington County are up Portland area, and Multnomah County hasn't applied. I think maybe Washington County has applied.
They were denied.
So Ryan's sister Lily lives in Washington County, and she works in Washington County. So.
Yeah, I saw that Washington got denied.
Okay.
Yeah, but they're the only two. Washington and Multnomah County is the only places in Oregon that are not allowed to move on to phase 1.
Right.
The rest of the state is okay. But about a week ago, there was a local court decision that some judge in the eastern part of the state that is it's like you said, not very populated. He made a decision that the governor's order of an emergency situation, the lockdown orders, were not valid.
Right.
And then some other things happened, but let's talk about that first. What was his reasoning? What was his reason to say that this lockdown that was supposed to be protecting the population was not valid? And the ethics of it, not now. Just the legal argument first.
Right. Our governors are not queens or kings, and so in order to, the governor issued an executive order, which is it has the force of law, but she has to find some provision of the state constitution or some power that the legislature gave to her to back up the order that she makes. And so, according to the judge in Baker County, which is not very populated, is that me squealing or you guys? He said that there was 3 places where the governor could have looked to find authority to do what she did. And one is in the state constitution, but in order to do that, she would have had to have the legislature come back and vote on it. So she could have called the legislature back and said, we have this emergency, give me the authority to do what I'm going to do. And then the other provision is a statute, and there's one that's sort of a general provision. And if you were to read it, it looks more like it applies to like earthquakes or big storms, that kind of thing, because it talks about taking control of the streets, taking control of businesses because you need these supplies. According to the judge, it doesn't say anything about restricting the movement of people and restricting what they can do. And so there's a second provision of the statute, the second statute, and it is specifically for public health emergencies. And so it's specific to this situation. And it gives the governor, that statute gives the governor the authority to restrict the movement of people, because when you have a health emergency, you need to restrict the movement of people. But the statute says she can do it for a 14-day period and an additional 14-day period. And so that's 28 days. And so what the judge said was, well, you didn't go to the Constitution and call the legislature back in. You used the general statute, but it doesn't really give you the authority to restrict the movement of people. And the one that does give you the authority to do that, you can only do for a 14-day period plus an additional 14-day period. And so that's 28 days. And since it's been more than 28 days, that you no longer have authority to do that. And then, you know, you have to sort of look at the federal Constitution. The US Constitution has a First Amendment, and it says it protects people's freedom to exercise religion, and it gives people the freedom, the right to peaceably assemble. And so people in the United States have the right, not because the Constitution gives it to them, but because the Constitution stops the government from doing things that violate these rights that exist. People have the right to exercise religion, and they have the right to assemble together. And so those are constitutional rights, which aren't, if you were to read court cases, they'll say something like, well, these rights are not absolute. And so it used to be, back in my memory even, that the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court had when the government was going to interfere with religion and assembly, you had to kind of run it through a grid work. And so if the government is going to interfere with the exercise of religion or with the right of the people to assemble, then the government had to have a compelling reason to do that. And it had to implement the least restrictive way possible to accomplish the compelling reason. And so that's the way we used to think about it. But then back in my memory again, there was actually an Oregon case where somebody was smoking peyote.
In Oregon, of course. This is
Yes.
very Oregonian.
And for some reason, these cases that make it all the way to the Supreme Court are always very interesting. But
Yeah.
he was smoking peyote until he got fired because we didn't want somebody smoking peyote working at the job. And he applied for unemployment benefits. And the Oregon Unemployment Department said, no, you cannot get unemployment benefits because you were smoking peyote. And so we're not going to give you benefits. And so he appealed up the chain. And the US Supreme Court actually changed the way they would analyze these things. And it wasn't that you would go through this grid. What it said was if there's a law of general applicability, if it applies to everybody, then if it happens to infringe on religion to a degree, then we're going to uphold it anyways. So you can see that how that's quite different.
What do you mean? I didn't follow that. If it's a general law and it applies to everyone, then the law is okay? Then you can keep the law?
Right. Even if it infringes on exercise of religion.
Because it doesn't infringe on a specific religion. Because it is...
If you passed a law that was aimed at religion, it would be no good.
Okay.
If it's a general law,
it just accidentally harms religion. It's not
right.
specifically focused on religion. It just kind of does it. I see.
And so under the old analysis, they might have said, well, smoking peyote is a religious practice of, these were Native Americans. And so does the government have a compelling reason to prevent the smoking of peyote? And if so, then is denying unemployment benefits the least restrictive way to do that? So it changed quite a bit. And then Congress right away passed what's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so they wanted to restore that test by legislation. And then a few years later, it was appealed up and the Supreme Court said, well, that's fine, but you can't impose this law on the states. And so the Religious Freedom Restoration Act applies to the federal government, but not to state and local governments.
So it's not that effective, really. I mean, kind of. Like the FBI can't do religious things, but like the state governments can't.
Yeah, the federal government can't pass laws that would infringe on religion unless it passes these tests.
Seems like that law did not do what they wanted it to do.
The Religious Freedom Restoration Act?
Yes.
No, it didn't, because they wanted to regulate the states. Yeah.
It only hurt themselves.
Yeah. And they passed this is sort of the difference here. They passed a companion one that's called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Protection Act, RLUIPA. And what it says is that the state governments, local governments can't pass land use laws that infringe on religion unless they meet these tests that were before. But what Congress did was it said it was passing the law under the Commerce Clause. And so Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. And so often they'll pass laws where they can point at interstate commerce to make the law constitutional, we call it. And so that law is still in effect. And so if you want to build a church somewhere, the land use laws won't necessarily stop you from building it there. Or if you're in prison and you want to wear different burqas and headdresses and hair, then a lot of prisoners can do things that the rest of us can't do because they're protected by this law.
Because it's a federal prison?
No, even state prison.
Okay.
Because that law applies to the states. So back to COVID-19.
Right.
The circuit court judge, so we have circuit courts in all the counties, and that's the first level of court. Well, some counties are combined, but when you start a lawsuit, you're going to start in the county circuit court.
And how many people are in Clackamas County where you live? Just to get an idea of how big it
Clackamas
is.
County is fairly big. I don't know.
Because we don't have counties here. There are no counties in Brazil. They don't exist.
Yeah, there might be 100,000 maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Multnomah County is the biggest.
It's like, they do not exist in Brazil. So there's nothing to compare them to. We have municipalities here, but the municipality just expands out until it hits the next municipality. And there's nothing between a municipality and a state government. Okay. So I cannot think of any way to even explain what a county is. Sometimes my students ask me, what is this? And they look at a map and they see like Clackamas County. And they're like, teacher, what is a county? I don't know. You don't have them, and there's no way to explain it to you because there's nothing even comparable.
Ryan, what's maybe similar here it's not the same, but well, there are 7 cities here in the ABCs: Santo André, São Bernardo, São Caetano, Diadema, Mauá, and 2 other that I can't remember. Well, anyways, and they have they formed a group, and they make decisions together. So maybe that's similar,
Yeah, that's close.
And that's close. That's not the same.
It's just that in the United States, there's like a lot of land. Like most of the country is land that's not in a city. It's just there being land owned by people, but it's not part of any city. It's governed by the county, but there's no city involved at all in what's going on. Yeah. And explaining this to students, they're always like, what? So after the circuit court of the county this was in made its ruling, then the state, the governor, appealed.
Right. So so you file a lawsuit in the circuit court, and then the other side will file papers. And when these people filed their lawsuit, they said, we want you, judge, to issue an injunction, a stay, saying that the governor's order is not valid. And that's it's a preliminary injunction. So it would make the governor's order invalid during the time that they're working up to where they're going to have a trial, a hearing on this thing. And so really the issue is, can the circuit court judge stay the governor's order? And so the governor, the state, asked him to stay his ruling, stay the ruling that he was staying the governor's order while they appealed. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. And so they appealed, and we have the Court of Appeals, and then we have the Oregon Supreme Court. So the Court of Appeals, it has to take anything that comes to it. And it doesn't always have a hearing, and sometimes it will, they call it AWOP. they'll affirm without an opinion. So they don't spend much time on it. They just say, you're right, and go away. And then if you lose at the Court of Appeals, then you can appeal to this Oregon Supreme Court, but it doesn't have to take the cases that come to it. You petition to, for review, they call it, to review the Court of Appeals order, and the Oregon Supreme Court can decide to take it or not to take it. And if they don't take it, then what the Court of Appeals said is what stands. And then if you lose at the Oregon Supreme Court, theoretically you can appeal to the US Supreme Court if it involves a question of federal law. If it's just strictly state law, then you're done when you're done with Oregon. And so what the governor did was she appealed directly to the Oregon Supreme Court. And what her appeal was that this injunction should not be enforced. And so the Oregon Supreme Court then said within 12 hours, I think, said, no, circuit court judge, you can't stay the governor's executive order, so it's back in effect. And then yesterday, I think it was, they sent it's called a writ of mandamus to the circuit court judge. And a writ of mandamus is an order from a judge directing a government person to do something. And so the governor asked the Oregon Supreme Court to issue a writ of mandamus to the circuit court judge, ordering him to vacate his injunction. And so that's what they did.
They told him that he was wrong, or are we just waiting for the Supreme Court to rule?
Well, they told him to either vacate his injunction or explain to them by Tuesday why they should uphold it. So the judge could make more argument. And if they lift the injunction, the case will continue. It's just that the governor's order will remain in effect while the case is proceeding.
Like, what do you think the legal decision ought to be regarding this lockdown situation?
Well, so I didn't read the statutes in detail. But normally, if there's a general statute and also a specific statute, we would apply the specific statute over the general statute. And because the legislature is who has the authority to grant authority to the governor. And so since the legislature took the time to pass this statute that says, well, Governor, in times of public health emergency, you have this authority, but you only have it for 14 days, and then you can extend it for another 14 days. And the language that is kind of important there. So it's a 14-day period, and you can extend it for an additional 14-day period.
One other.
And so it seems to me that since the legislature went to that trouble, that's the law that should apply to this situation. And to say that the governor doesn't have to invoke that statute, but can use the general statute, means that this specific statute is basically meaningless, because she doesn't have to use it. She can use and our governor's a woman, is why I say she. And so it seems to me that the circuit court judge was probably right. And the reason he gave was, well, the governor is interfering with people's constitutional rights here, the right to assemble, the right to move freely about. And so therefore the legislature has imposed requirements on her for taking these extreme measures, because we take that kind of stuff pretty seriously up here.
And also, I think one of the things that the judge said in the original opinion was the right to religion. the right to have church services. That was a big part of his
Yeah.
decision too, right?
And so that is another issue. And if you took the Peyote case, you would say, well, the governor can shut down places of business, gatherings, and as long as it applies equally, then it would meet the Peyote case standard. But this whole time, I've been able to go to Home Depot, and I've been able to go to Thriftway, and so people are allowed to go to places of business in numbers that exceed that she had a number of 10 people. But if you go to Home Depot or other businesses, and so the order treats churches differently than it treats other places of business. And we go to two churches. The one here in town is fairly large, and so we might have 250, 300 people at a church service on Sunday, and that's unworkable. And so, even if the governor said, yeah, you can have church, I imagine that our leaders over there would say, just a minute, we're gonna figure out how to do this a little more safely, and particularly because there's a lot of elderly people at church. And so if we could reopen our church, we would do it probably pretty carefully. The other church we're a part of, it meets in Portland, and we meet on Saturdays at a different church. We rent space from the other church, and there might be at most 20 or 25 of us in this big church sanctuary. And the fact is that even before this pandemic, most of the people are from the islands of Palau, and they would, even without a virus, they would spread out all over the church. And so we would have maybe 20 or 30 feet between groups of people. And so there is no public health reason for our Portland church not to meet together. And so, that's what the circuit court judge said was, well, yeah, maybe in Portland at big churches, you can close them down. But, in Baker County, you have a church building with 20 people coming to it, and there's no rational reason why you should shut them down. And so it's sort of in the States, we have this divide between it's liberal and conservative. That's the tag words. And the liberal side, they have a lot more trust in the government to manage things and control things, and they think we should follow what the experts say. And the conservatives say, well, no, we don't want so much government. We want the government to do some things, but we can decide whether we should go to church, and we can decide how we can safely do that. And so that's a big divide in the U.S. And our judges are elected, all of them. And so if you're in Baker County, you're in Eastern Oregon, and it's more conservative group of people. And so they will elect more conservative judges. But if you're in Multnomah County in Portland, there's more liberal people. And so they'll elect more liberal judges. And the Court of Appeals and the Oregon Supreme Court are elected statewide. And so the Multnomah County, Clackamas County, Marion County, the counties over here in the Willamette Valley, that's where most of the votes are. And so that will be reflected in the kind of judges that get elected. And plus, most of the time, the Court of Appeals judges and the Oregon Supreme Court justices, they'll retire in the middle of their term. I think they have 4-year terms. And then if they retire, they get replaced by the governor. And so the governor will appoint people that agree with what he or she generally believes. And so the Court of Appeals and the Oregon Supreme Court tend to be more liberal than conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you're appointed, you run unopposed all the time.
I
And
remember
so,
on the ballot. I think I've
Yeah.
showed you, Rodrigo, a few times the ballot that I get.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the judges are almost never opposed. There's one name in the judge's spot.
Yeah.
And I've started just writing in my dad for a judge. So after every election, you can go check out and see that there's one vote for
All
Andrew
right.
Kauffman for for Oregon State Supreme Court every
I'm
year.
surprised your mom doesn't vote for me.
There you go. Get 2. Vote for yourself. Get 3. There you go. Well on your way. So just the last question, and try to be kind of brief. I totally agree with you about the law. It seems not even difficult to read this. It shouldn't be controversial that the law says 14 days, one other 14-day period. That's what the law says. But there are larger ethical issues going on here. And like, what do you think should happen
With the virus?
with this court case? Like, I think it's a much more complicated issue. It seems very clear to me that legally, the circuit judge was right, and that shouldn't be controversial. But ethically, that's a more complicated question, and I am not sure what I think. Do you have an opinion?
Well, I guess the big question is whether he was right to issue the stay. That's a question. And so that takes a whole legal analysis. But in the end, reading the law, the appellate court should uphold his ruling that the governor had no authority to issue the orders. And that's because judges are supposed to follow the law. And the fact is that the governor chose the statute under which she ordered these things to happen. She could have called the legislature in, and they could have voted and given her more authority, longer authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it is her responsibility, but we shouldn't, we have a whole history of this. We can't let government officials sort of flout the law because it's convenient at the time.
Or necessary.
And that's, you can tell which side of the divide I'm on because, we ought to have limited government, and the government should only be able to do the things that the people say they can do, whether that's through the legislature or in the Constitution. So, we can't let our governors overstep their authority even when we think it's right, because down the road they may overstep it in ways that we don't think is so good.
For sure.
And so the legislature and I forget who put it must have been the people of Oregon are who amend the Constitution. And so maybe the legislature referred that provision out to them. But the people of Oregon said in our Constitution, here, Governor, when you have a public health crisis, here's the authority that you have to deal with it.
And no more. This is the limit of your authority.
Right. If she doesn't want to follow what the people have said, then her orders ought to be struck down.
Yeah.
It might be, the Court of Appeals, the Oregon Supreme Court, even the U.S. Supreme Court can be sort of politically minded. And so the Oregon Supreme Court might have said, well, we can, there's an argument to be made that this judge's stay, his injunction shouldn't be left in place. And then we can just let it go through the process and the virus will work out. And by the time it gets back up to us again, we can say that the governor had no authority to do what she did.
Which would be after like 4 more 14-day periods that
That'd be
were
a long time. Yeah.
after, like, which were totally illegal. So, but
just one thing I'd like to add. We for the past 2 or 3 years, Mr. Kauffman, we have the same divide here in Brazil. We have the conservative and the liberals too. It's not exactly the same, of course. We have totally different history, but we have the same divide now, especially about the situation about COVID, and also legally speaking, our governors are against the federal government. Our governors are actually on the liberal side, right, Ryan? Governors and mayors.
I guess it's hard to generalize, but yes, you could say that.
Yeah, I mean, according to the
if you're talking about COVID, then yes.
COVID, yeah, about COVID specifically, and because right now we are living a very strong conservative wave, so most of them are conservative, but within the conservative people, the conservative politicians, governors and mayors right now at this moment are a bit more liberal. And our president is very, very conservative. And so people are trying to impeach the president. The whole process here is we have no health responsible in the country. We have one, but it's just how can I say? Help me out here, Ryan. It's just a
figurehead. A figurehead.
Exactly.
But he's rather there, powerless.
You know? Exactly.
And he keeps getting fired. Like the president appoints someone and then fires him and appoints a new one and fires him.
And the last one, there was a doctor that really understood about health. He resigned, and right at this moment the position is vacant. There's a military guy there, but the position is vacant. So the people are lost, right? At the moment, and I don't know. This is difficult time,
and something different in Brazil is that the Supreme Court, I think, decided that cities and states have like almost unlimited power to deal with the coronavirus. They had a ruling a while ago, and they said, whatever restrictions that were in place, they don't exist for this crisis.
Yeah, it was.
You guys can do whatever you think is best. The cities and states.
Kind of like what your father was saying. He was talking about the specific and the general. That usually the specific rolls over the general, and they decided that the cities and states they have the power to choose what they're going to do, which is new. It's kind of new because here in Brazil it's nothing like this.
So we're seeing a lot of weird laws and overstepping of authority. That's strange.
From all over.
Yeah. And not very effective most of the time. No. It's just they're trying random crap, and most of it doesn't work, but they just want to appear effective.
Yeah.
Is anything else? Is there anything you want to ask us? We've been asking you questions all the time. Do you have a question?
Not really. How's the virus doing down there? I watched the numbers and they seem to be increasing.
It's getting worse and worse. We're now the second country in the world, right after you guys. And the US appears to have leveled. So it's not getting better. It's not getting worse. It's just sort of hanging out. And we are zooming upwards. And there's this fight between the federal government and the states. There aren't really effective measures going on.
No.
So
and one keeps shutting the other down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You're not on stay-at-home orders anymore, or?
No, they do, but then people ignore them, and there's no real authority to enforce them.
Right?
It's solid.
Are businesses open for the most part? Restaurants, bars?
It depends. Like here in Sao Paulo, most of the restaurants and bars are closed. But if you go out to country cities, like one of my students lives in Pindamonhangaba. Rodrigo knows where that is, but it's like 3-4 hours away from here.
Yeah.
She says that everything is open. It's not so different. And she works in a restaurant. She says that. It's not different. People come in, they have meals, they go out, whatever. So,
Yeah.
who knows?
Yeah, it's this is working just the same way as everything always worked around here. There's no specific rules or no organizations, just people were randomly doing
It's
what
like
they think.
what you said. What was that phrase that you used to describe Sao Paulo?
It's organized chaos, or
That's right.
loosely organized.
Loosely
chaos.
organized chaos.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how I would describe the response to the coronavirus.
Yeah.
And
Then we're
the
gonna have a loose
economy-
name.
Will the
Sorry?
economy take a big hit, you think?
Already has, for
Already
sure.
has.
Definitely.
Yeah, we're fortunate that the federal government can print a lot of money and send it out to, kind of uphold the economy a little bit. And we have the capacity to do that, where I don't think anybody else in the world really does.
The Brazilian government did a little bit, but nothing compared to what the United States government has already done and is considering. Like the United States government is planning on spending trillions more dollars to help the economy.
Yeah, we did 3, I think, the first couple go-arounds, but that wasn't all of it, because we have the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and they have massive authority to take what Congress gave them, but they can leverage it. And so if they have the authority for 3 trillion, they can leverage it to 8 or 9 trillion.
Yeah.
And so they help companies, or they've been buying at the outset, the financial markets. Nobody wanted to buy certain bonds and that kind of thing. And so the Fed stepped in and actually bought the bonds to keep the markets open.
Underwriting a bunch of bad debt, keeping the market solvent. Yeah, there's not really that here.
And I mean, it's a good thing that we can do that, because otherwise,
just look at the difference in our currencies. The dollar has gotten marginally stronger, not a lot, but a little. And the real has lost half its value in the last 18 months.
Wow.
From being worth 3 to being worth 6.
Yeah.
I think since you were here.
I think so. It was
around 4.
29 or 30 cents.
Yeah.
30 per dollar, I think.
So that's around 30
cents per real. And last I looked, it was 16 cents, almost half.
And that's 18 months? When were you here?
Probably.
Yeah. So that's
what
happened.
We're very fortunate. It's like the bad tasting water that I mentioned before, is that we complain about all this stuff, but we're very lucky, actually, because we have the resources to take care of things. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we can wrap it up today. Thank you a lot, Dad, for coming on and talking. That was really.
Thank you very much.
I didn't know a lot of that stuff, and you're my dad, so I've known you forever.
Well, we don't always start talking about.
That's true. The intricacies of interstate law,
preliminary injunctions, and that kind of thing.
It's not a random dinner conversation, I suppose.
I thought that was what you did in Thanksgiving.
Well, maybe if Grandpa Kauffman was there, sometimes those topics come up when we go to Denny's. But
yes.
Usually when he's trying to troll us into some kind of argument, then he'll.
We stopped talking about it mostly. So.
Okay. Thanks everybody for watching.
right.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you all next week. See you later.
Thank you very much.